So we have 16 points of the summary. When we finish with that, our Acts of the Apostles classes get over. Okay. The first point, you write. Summary. Message of Acts of the Apostles. The Acts of the Apostles Luke's second volume continues his presentation of biblical history. His presentation of biblical history. He describes how the salvation promised to Israel, how the salvation promised to Israel in the Old Testament and accomplished by Jesus has now under the guidance of the Holy Spirit been extended, has been, B-E-E-N, has been extended to the Gentiles. Okay, not for writing. So, one word of explanation. God chose the people of Israel and He promised a Messiah. Okay, so salvation, and through that Messiah salvation will come. And now in the New Testament we speak about Jesus and how He brings about salvation through His death and resurrection. He has reconciled men with God. Now those who believe in Him become members of the Christian community. And now how the people come to believe in Jesus is talked about in the Acts of the Apostles. How the gospel, the message of Jesus spreads through the efforts of the apostles, and how it spreads from Jerusalem to Rome. Okay. The next, second point. In the first 7 chapters, of Acts, we are in Jerusalem. Then in chapter 8, and the following chapters, we see the church taking root in Judea, in Samaria, and along the coastal plain. along the coastal plain. From chapter 13 onwards, we accompany Paul to Asia Minor, and to Greece, and finally in chapter 28 to Rome. In chapter 28 to Rome, R-O-M-E, Rome, the heart of the pagan world, the heart of the pagan world. Third point. The spread of the gospel from Jerusalem to Rome was accomplished through divinely chosen representatives. Divinely, D-I-V-I-N-E-L-Y, divinely chosen representatives. Chapter 10 verse 41, whom Jesus prepared during his historical ministry. During his historical ministry. Chapter 1 verses 21 and 22. And commissioned after his resurrection as witnesses to all that he taught. Chapter 1 verse 8, chapter 10 verses 37 to 43, Luke chapter 24, 48. Luke 24, 48. So I will read that point again. The spread of the gospel from Jerusalem to Rome was accomplished through the divinely chosen representatives whom Jesus prepared during his historical ministry and commissioned after his resurrection as witnesses to all that he taught. Next point, 4. Peter was the leading member of the 12. Peter was the leading member of the 12. Chapter 1 verse 13 and verse 15. A miracle worker like Jesus in the gospel. A miracle worker like Jesus in the gospel. Chapter 3 verses 1 to 10. Chapter 5, verses 1 to 11 and verse 15. Chapter 9, verses 32 to 35. The object of divine care. Chapter 5, 17 to 21. Chapter 12, 6 to 11. And the spokesman for the Christian community. Chapter 2, 14 to 36. Chapter 3, 12 to 46. Chapter 4, 8 to 12. Chapter 5, 29 to 32. Chapter 10, 34 to 43. Chapter 15, 7 to 11. Peter was largely responsible. Peter was largely responsible for the growth of the community. In the early days. He dominates the first 12 chapters. He dominates the first 12 chapters. And devotes himself particularly to the evangelization of the Jews. I read that point again. Peter was the leading member of the 12, a miracle worker like Jesus in the gospel, the object of divine care and the spokesman for the Christian community. He was largely responsible for the growth of the community in the early days. He dominates the first 12 chapters and devotes himself particularly to the evangelization of the Jews. Next point, 5. Paul eventually joined the community. Paul eventually joined the community at Antioch. Chapter 11, 25 and 26, which commissioned him and Barnabas, to undertake the spread of the gospel to Asia Minor. This missionary venture VNTURE. This missionary venture generally failed to win, win the Jews of the diaspora. The Jews of the diaspora. To the gospel. But had success among the Gentiles. Chapter 13 verse 14 to chapter 14 verse 27. Repeat. Chapter 13 verse 14 to chapter 14 verse 27, namely the first missionary journey. He dominates the second part of the Acts. Becoming the apostle of the Gentiles. I read it again. Paul eventually joined the community at Antioch, which commissioned him and Barnabas to undertake the spread of the gospel to Asia Minor. This missionary venture generally failed to win the Jews of the diaspora to the gospel, but enjoyed success among the Gentiles, or had success among the Gentiles. He dominates the second part of the Acts, becoming the apostle of the Gentiles. The next point, 6. Paul's refusal to impose Mosaic law, impose Mosaic law, especially circumcision. Upon his Gentile converts. Provoked very strong objection. Among the Jewish Christians of Jerusalem. Chapter 15 verse 1. But both Peter and James supported his position. In the Jerusalem Council. Officially opening the way for the spread of the gospel to Gentiles. Opening the way for the spread of the gospel to Gentiles. Chapter 15 verses 6 to 21. I read that point again. Paul's refusal to impose Mosaic law, especially circumcision, among the Jewish especially circumcision upon his Gentile converts, provoked very strong objection among the Jewish Christians of Jerusalem, but both Peter and James supported his position in the Jerusalem Council, officially opening the way for the spread of the gospel to the Gentiles. Point number 7. Paul's second and third missionary journeys. Paul's second and third missionary journeys. Chapter 16, verse 36 to chapter 21, verse 16. 16:36 to 21:16 resulted in the same pattern of failure. Resulted in the same pattern of failure among the Jews generally. But enjoyed some success among the Gentiles. I repeat, Paul's second and third missionary journeys resulted in the same pattern of failure among the Jews generally, but enjoyed some success among the Gentiles. Next point, 8. Paul, like Peter, is presented as a miracle worker. Chapter 14, verse 8 to 18. Chapter 19, verse 12. Chapter 20, verses 7 to 12. And the object of divine care. Chapter 16, verse 25 to 31. 16, 25 to 31. I repeat, I read again. Paul, like Peter, is presented as a miracle worker and the object of divine care. Next point, 9. In Acts of the Apostles, Luke has provided a broad survey of the church's development from the resurrection of Jesus to Paul's Roman imprisonment. The point at which the book ends. I read it again. In Acts, Luke has provided a broad survey of the church's development from the resurrection of Jesus to Paul's Roman imprisonment. The point at which the book ends. Next point, 10. Luke describes Luke describes the emergence of Christianity. Emergence. Emergence means coming out. Emergence of Christianity from its origin in Judaism. From its origin in Judaism to its position as a religion of worldwide status, and appeal. I read the point again. Luke describes the emergence of Christianity from its roots in Judaism to its position as a religion of worldwide status and appeal. Next point, 11. Originally a Jewish Christian community in Jerusalem. Originally a Jewish Christian community in Jerusalem. The church was placed in circumstances that led it to include within its membership people of other cultures, namely the Samaritans, chapter 8, 4 to 25, 4, chapter 8, verse 4 to verse 25. At first an occasional Gentile, chapter 8 verses 26 to 30, and chapter 10 1 to 48, and finally the Gentiles on principle. Chapter 11 verses 20 and 21. I read it again. Originally a Jewish Christian community in Jerusalem, the church was placed in circumstances that led it to include within its membership people of other cultures, namely the Samaritans, at first an occasional Gentile, and finally Gentiles on principle. Next point, 12. Persecution of Christians following the killing of Stephen. Gave the momentum, M-O-M-E-N-T-U-M, momentum. Momentum means the push. Gave the momentum for spreading the faith to other cultures. for spreading the faith to other cultures. Chapter 8, verse 1, verse 4. 8, verse 1, verse 4. I read it again. Persecution of Christians following the killing of Stephen gave the momentum for spreading of the faith to other cultures. Next point, 13. Fear on the part of the Jewish people. Fear on the part of the Jewish people that Christianity particularly as preached to the Gentiles threatened their own cultural heritage, caused them to be suspicious of Paul's gospel. Chapter 13, verses 42 to 45. Chapter 5, verses 1 to 5. Okay, we proceed. Number 14. The inability of Christian missionaries to remove this fear of the Jews inevitably created a situation in which the gospel was preached more and more to the Gentiles. Toward the end of Paul's career, the Christian communities with the exception of those in Palestine itself, were mainly of Gentile membership. I read it again. The inability of Christian missionaries to remove this fear of the Jews inevitably created a situation in which the gospel was preached more and more to the Gentiles. Toward the end of Paul's career, the Christian communities, with the exception of those in Palestine itself, were mainly of Gentile membership. Next point, 15. In tracing the emergence of Christianity, in tracing the emergence of Christianity from Judaism, Luke is insistent. Luke is insistent on the prominence of Israel, on the prominence of Israel in the divine plan of salvation. In the divine plan of salvation. Chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. Chapter 3, verses 13 to 15. Chapter 10, verse 36. Chapter 13, 16 to 41. Chapter 24, 14 and 15. And the extension of salvation. To the Gentiles. Has been a part of the divine plan. Has been a part of the divine plan from the beginning. Chapter 15, 13 to 18, chapter 26, 22 and 23. I read the point again. In tracing the emergence of Christianity from Judaism, Luke is insistent on the prominence of Israel in the divine plan of salvation. And the extension of salvation to the Gentiles has been a part of the divine plan from the beginning. In other words, Israel has prominence in God's plan of salvation, but spreading the faith to Gentiles also is part of God's plan from the beginning. Last point, 16. The Holy Spirit is the real actor in the birth of the church. Is the real actor in the birth of the church. This is the reason many commentators called this book the Gospel of the Holy Spirit. Called this book the Gospel of the Holy Spirit. Okay, that is so short, I won't repeat. So 16 points. Line of thought, okay, which underlines why. One point that is very important that is underlined is why Jews didn't accept, Jews as a whole didn't accept Jesus' message, because they are afraid that when, since Paul was preaching to the Gentiles and Gentile Christians come, they will lose their cultural identity. Remember what Stephen said, God doesn't live in the temple made by human hands. So, temple is an essential part of their identity. That is God. And they are blamed for everything, putting Jesus to death. And all that made them afraid that they will lose their identity if they become Christians. On the one hand, that prevented them from accepting Christ. On the other hand, that that gave the opportunity for the preachers of the gospel, Peter and Paul, especially Paul, to appeal to the Gentiles. And the Gentiles accepted that faith. And therefore, faith went out of Palestine to Asia Minor, Greece and Rome. So it reaches the end of the world. So this spread of the message of Christ to the end of the world is the burden of the book of Acts of the Apostles. And the role of the Holy Spirit is obvious. The role of the apostles, the two main apostles, Peter and Paul, very obvious. Because Holy Spirit cannot go and preach. He is not seen. He is an inner power. Therefore, he has to work through human beings. And Jesus had foreseen this. That's why Jesus, during his earthly ministry, chose 12. So that after his death and resurrection, he will give them the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit will push them, animate them. You have animation center here. Animate them and to go out to the world. So he is the real power behind the missionaries, especially Peter and Paul, and obviously you cannot forget Stephen, Philip, the Hellenists. They had a big role to play. For Luke, church itself is missionary. Don't forget that. So with that we conclude.